I'm LeeAnn Brownell. I'm the EAL consultant with HRCE. I've been an EAL teacher now for, 11 years, and I've been in this role for 2.5 years now. So thank you for joining me. We'll get started here. So I just want to check, is everyone familiar with actually conducting running records?
Yes.
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 Okay.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So just an overview of today's session. We're going to talk a bit about the background and why this document was created. We'll talk about getting ready to assess, some of the things that you should consider and suggestions around making the practice of doing a running record a little bit more equitable. And then we'll look at some of the language related approximations. So kind of comparing a little bit about why working and assessing with EAL students is different than monolingual English speaking students. So a bit of the background to this is just being aware of, I should backtrack. As an EAL teacher, when I would do running records, sometimes I would notice that there would be a discrepancy between a level, what the EAL student what I came out with versus what the classroom teacher came out with. And then we would have lots of conversation, lots of back and forth around how did we get to where we were. And one of the things that kind of became a trend, I guess, or a pattern was some classroom teachers would would focus more so on the fluency piece versus comprehension. And so while we don't want the students reading like to the point that they're very much struggling, but we want to kind of balance that so that they're not being kept at lower level texts when they're understanding higher level text. So they might be able to read a level J book perfectly, can't comprehend it, but they might be able to read a level E book, have really strong comprehension, but the fluency piece might not be there. But if they're speaking, I'm getting ahead of myself because I all this. Okay. So anyway, students learning English are also learning literacy and the language of instruction simultaneously. And this can result in reading behaviors that differ from what monolingual English students' reading behaviors are. And sometimes when you're used to working with English speaking students, you get sort of in that kind of frame of mind. And it's really easy to compare that with the EAL student, and sometimes people are left with a lot of questions. So this document, I did create this document. I did all the research behind it, created it, and then I worked closely with the reading recovery teacher leads for HRCE, and then both the literacy facilitators for elementary and secondary level. So there's been a lot of eyes on this document. And then it's been rolled out through HRCE, and there's been some sharing, different people throughout the province. So one we're going to look at is being aware of language-related tendencies and how we can use this to inform our instruction when we're teaching. Discrepancies in the results. So looking at it, sort of balancing fluency with the comprehension piece, because we want them to have both, and we want them to be exposed to appropriate level texts where they are practicing their reading skills and also understanding what they are reading to a certain level. Providing students with more access to more appropriate texts, and just really looking at how can we improve our assessment practices. So what is equitable and what is recommended so that they're not being stuck with lower level texts. There has been a little bit of discussion through some schools that I've presented this with, and some of the EAL teachers that have shared this document have said, the classroom teachers come back with, well, we've never done it that way, or that's how we've always done it. And so really the message is around setting the students up for success and not putting them at a disadvantage from the get-go because of the way it's always been done. Because clearly with more research and being more equitable, we see that it's okay to change the way we do things. It's best for the students. So a lot of the questions and a lot of that comment being made around we've never done it this before or whatever was really around the seen versus unseen texts. If you look, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look through the document or not, but it was originally, it did say that you could use seen texts. And we got a lot of questions back around no, we only do unseen texts. How many times can it be seen? So I have updated the document that will talk around a bit about appropriate, like language levels of the students. So we'll get into that. So if a student has been here for, a year or more, year and a half, 2 years, they're at that intermediate level, then you could be using unseen text because there is some value to that because you want to see what reading strategies are they using? What comprehension strategies are they using? Can they make sense out of something that they're completely unfamiliar with? When they are relatively new and at the beginner level of both English proficiency and as a reader, you might want to give them a scene text. Now, I believe it says, the student shouldn't have practiced the book with a teacher, and they shouldn't have seen the book more than 3 times. So, but you should consider something that is familiar. Maybe, you've done a book walkthrough, they've looked at the pictures, they've maybe looked at some of the harder words. Does the student have, background knowledge on the topic of the book? Are they familiar with this type of text? You can do book introductions. So it may just be as simple as talking about the book and reading the provided introduction given. Or you may want to actually look through the book, look at some of the pictures, talk about it a bit. And you are allowed to use devices. So you can use Google Translate for some of the harder words. You could have pictures. You can show them images and maybe a video clip if necessary. I know there was one teacher, she was I can't remember if she was ELS or reading recovery, it doesn't matter. And she was going to be reading a book with a student about a picnic when she realized, oh, the student doesn't know what a picnic is. And the text that they were reading was a little bit confusing because it was about animal that was going on a picnic, but the animal was packing all of the all really strange things to take to a picnic. So it was kind of a bit confusing for the student. So all the teacher did was translated the word picnic, showed a few pictures of what you would take on a picnic, talked about it like when you go on a picnic, what do you take? What do you do on a picnic? And then that really kind of set the groundwork in supporting that student as they read. So at the end of the book, this student knew the animal didn't really take the right things to the picnic. This document actually, they have one for I think it's like guidelines for assessing French immersion students. And the same thing. Now, I will say, I always told or suggested that anyone like that would take guidance from their literacy supervisor, consultant, whoever they are, because even I sat in on some meetings that the literacy consultants had with the reading recovery and the ELS teachers. And there was even discrepancy because one consultant said, no, it should be unseen. And the other consultant said, no, you can use seen. So it's still ongoing. So in terms of language, or sorry, like if you're doing French immersion or an EAL student, I would kind of go around like their oral language level and where are they at? Are they beginner level? Are they have some exposure, or sorry, more developed language that they could do unseen texts, or, you know, I guess it's kind of what you're familiar or what you're comfortable with, and knowing your students and how they could um, handle either or. That's interesting. There's lots of debate around it, and that's why I ended up having to put like in this document for multilingual students. Um, When determining if a seen or unseen text should be used for the assessment, consider the student's English proficiency level and length of time in Canada. If a student has beginner level proficiency in English and they have been here for less than 1 year, the text should be seen. If the student is at the intermediate level and beyond with their English proficiency, um, or they were born in Canada, the text can be unseen. Please keep in mind that each student comes with different background experiences and levels of English, and all of these factors must be taken into account when determining the use of seen or unseen text. So, again, it's just about knowing your students and their background, and maybe in the beginning, the first couple of running records that you do, if the student is new, maybe it would be seen, and then as they become familiar, um, and are practicing their reading behaviors, maybe it would be an unseen text. I think a lot of it is just teachers get so used to doing it with English students that they just, here's this Fontes and Pinnell text. I should have asked, is anyone at the secondary level here?
No,
No.
Okay. Because it does get harder at the secondary level because they don't have access to all these, a wide variety of level texts, because they don't necessarily have to be what comes from the kit. And sometimes people are a little bit rigid in that. Whereas if it's an unseen text, it wouldn't necessarily matter because you do have those correlation charts. So if they read a PM and your district records Fontes, or I don't know, but everyone's a little bit different, but you can use whatever level text and then use the correlation chart to determine what that was, depending on what the oh my gosh, what's the word? What the standards are, I guess, that you're using. All right. So some things to consider when getting ready to assess would be looking at prior knowledge. So Equitable Assessment of Reading suggests that they be familiar with the topics that they're going to read about, because this gives a more accurate picture of what they can do in terms of reading. What knowledge or vocabulary do they have related to the topic? And is the cultural context of this familiar to the student? So this is even just bizarre for English-speaking students, but there's a Fontes and Pinnell text where the neighbor has a carousel in his garage. Well, that's bizarre. And so all of that would be even more strange to a student who's maybe never been to a fair, never seen the fair. And now they've got this carousel in a garage at your home. So that's different. Giving choice between fiction and nonfiction texts is always important. Because both really have value. Are they in a nonfiction text? Are they referring to some of these nonfiction text features? In a fiction text, are they able to kind of make sense of if there's some slang in a text, or just the context of it? Would they get what is happening? Can they read between the lines? And then I had just kind of spoken to this earlier about that the prior knowledge is very important, but it's also very telling of a student's reading ability when they can read an unfamiliar text with a fairly decent level of comprehension. And this does kind of become more I guess, relevant as they become more emergent and transitional level. Yeah, so if you're at a P-8 school, you would at least still have access. I know that, or to those level texts, but yeah, it had kind of come that, at the high school level, they really only have the benchmark assessment kit and that's all. So it comes a little bit more difficult. But at least knowing if you have a beginner reader at the higher level, that's kind of a problem. But as they become sort of at that transitional fluent level, you could look at reading behaviors and you could assess using a blank running record just a text that they have, a book that they're reading, get them to read a passage to you. Okay. So pronunciation. So if the word is a new word for the student and they mispronounce it, it should not be counted as an error, and you would just give them the proper pronunciation of the word. But if the word is a high frequency word that has been taught and the student mispronounces it, then that should be counted as an error because it shows that they have kind of internalized that incorrectly. And then you would make note to teach that as you continue in your classroom. And the phonics. If the student is literate in their home language and they are aware of the sound symbol code, English graphemes may sound different in their home language, and so they might make errors when they're reading. And it should not be counted as an error, but you would again make a note to do some follow-up instruction on the phonics. So, for example, vowel sounds might be different in a different language. So, if we look at the Spanish language, the short I might be pronounced as our long E. So tin, they would say that as teen. And some sounds are very difficult for different languages. So if we look at the F and the P, that is the Filipino language. So fun might sound like, oh, it was very pun. So the F sounds like the P. Portuguese language is the R and the L. Some of the Indian languages, there's the W and the V. And, oh no, sorry, Asian languages for R and L. Portuguese is the R and the H. And then Arabic, the ch and the sh. So if they see ch, they make it as the sh sound. So church would be like shush. So some of those are a little bit difficult for the speakers. So again, you would just take those into consideration and kind of focus that on your teaching, or you could speak with the EAL teacher about, you work on these sounds. But if someone says, oh, it was very good, you wouldn't mark that as an error. And I can't remember, I'm just going to go back.
LeeAnn, Natasha's just asked, at what point do errors due to phonological difference become errors once they become intermediate English language learners?
Well, that's the other thing you have to take into consideration is because it kind of depends on when they get here. So if you're kind of at that elementary level, I don't think they really would ever become errors because sometimes students, they only speak English when they're at school, and when they go home and all weekend, they still speak that language. So it might just be something that's ongoing. I know when students arrive kind of at that 13-year-old mark, they typically will keep their accents. And so it's you can ask them maybe to reread, or you could have a little discussion around it. But I don't think it really becomes that much of an issue because when their students are in elementary school, they will lose their accents and they will be able to make all of these sounds without a problem. But if it's at the junior high school level, I can't imagine you would really ever do that because it's who they are. It's like there's certain sounds that if we went somewhere else that we might not ever be able to make because it's just not in our makeup. That, some people have an affinity for learning languages and making all of the sounds, and other people it's quite difficult. But it kind of becomes an issue when they don't know the difference, though. And I think the other thing too, and we'll talk about it shortly, is oral language. So if you hear them speaking with friends or asking you questions and they're not making that error, but then they make it when they're reading, then that kind of shows you that they're not reading through the words, right? Like they're not looking at the letters and saying it, but they are applying it when they're speaking, then that would be an error. But if it's just like it's consistent, then it wouldn't be. Because it's just kind of saying like their mouth might not be able to make that sound. And I can't remember if I speak to it later or now. I think it's later, but it's basically about like if they read a word, but they're still but they read it wrong. So it'll be a matter of decoding. So like agricola versus agricola, or demonstrate versus demonstrate. If they're still following, like they're reading through the word and that's technically how it could be said, then that would not be an error. Now, if it becomes like, a very familiar routine word and this continues on and they're at kind of that intermediate level, they should be very familiar with that term, then yes, it will be counted as an error. All right, so comprehension. So the comprehension questions may need to be reworded so that the student understands what information is being asked of them. So they may very well have very solid understanding of the text, but they might not really be able to understand the questions. Some of the questions that come provided for you are wordy or awkward. So you can always reword them for clarity. If the student gives a one-word answer, you are encouraged to try and pull more information out. So you can use prompts. You can reword the questions. You can make the questions a little bit more clear, and give them credit for what they do know. So I've had students be able to read a text in English, but not be confident enough or comfortable or have the language to actually speak about it. But if you ask them questions in their home language, so you can use a translator, or maybe they understand the question and they want to speak into the translator, or maybe they want to write about what they've read. Maybe they want to show, pointing to a visual, gesturing, whatnot. You should give them credit. I have had countless number of students read a text, and then I will ask them, can you give me a summary? Can you tell me what you learned, beginning, middle, end, or whatnot? And they will stare blankly at me. And then I'll say, can you speak about this in your home language? You can use the translator. And they show thorough understanding of what they've read. I've had students write, for their writing assessment about what they've read in their home language. And then I take a picture of it with the Google Translate, and it shows, very, very strong understanding. Or sometimes it shows that they have the gist of what they've read. And that's also very important because as their vocabulary grows, so will their comprehension. So always make sure you have access to a device when you're doing reading record. Questions asked must be related to the text. So you could do literal or inferred, but it must be for the purpose of reading comprehension and not to assess cultural knowledge. And is the student able to write about what they read? So again, I've kind of spoken to that. And within this document, there are prompts provided for you. if you're using, if they don't understand maybe some of the questions that have been given to you from the actual recording sheet, or if you're using the recording sheet, the blank one. So there are some questions in here that you could use. Right, so I spoke a bit about the translation already. Idiom and slang, you can ask the students if they understood the phrase or a word, and if not, you are able to give the literal explanation prior to comprehension. So if you're going to be giving a student text, you might want to make sure that you read through it first so that you are prepared. So if there is something that may cause confusion for them, you're aware of it ahead of time. Names and characters of places, names of characters and places, etc. You can give them that word, but if they continue to say it incorrectly, that would be counted as an error, but just once. So there's a book about Kate. She's at the farm. But sometimes they'll call the character Cat or Catty. So you can tell them the word, but if they continue throughout calling her Cat, then that would just be the one error. So, but you can give them those names. They can be difficult for them. All right. So a few other things to consider. So we always have to make note if students are reading to the end of some of the words, but dropping verb endings and plurals. So it is possible that these errors are language approximations rather than evidence of incomplete looking. So again, you want to have a good understanding of what their oral language is. So when you are chatting with them or when you hear them talking to their peers, are they speaking the same way they're reading, or are they speaking accurately, but not applying that? You're not seeing that when they read, then that is evidence of incomplete looking. So if you hear them, they're saying, oh, I'm going to the gym, or she plays at lunch. But when you read with this student and then they say she play, or whatnot, or if they're speaking using past tense with the ed, but they don't read the ed, then that would be an error. But if they speak the same way they read, then that's not necessarily because it's not incomplete looking. It's just where they are in kind of like the language learning journey. But again, notes for instruction. Does it sound right? So this isn't always an appropriate strategy with the students learning English. So what's recommended is maybe giving a couple of examples and seeing if they can identify which one sounds right. Progression to more challenging and appropriate texts may be hindered if accuracy and fluency is emphasized over comprehension. So I did speak about this kind of at the beginning in my introduction, in that some teachers would want the student to be able to read with a strong level of accuracy and fluency before moving them on to more challenging texts. But what happens is they're not being challenged to be working on their reading comprehension strategies or any reading strategies. They're not being exposed to a richer vocabulary, and so they just kind of get stuck. And it's possible that I've had students read beautifully at transitional fluent levels, and it's kind of very monotone, very word for word, but they have a really solid understanding. So I think it's important to really focus on what is the appropriate level text where they're understanding what they're reading. And then that would be for your instruction, is to again read like you're speaking, so it's more natural and whatnot. But if the student is really struggling and it's really word for word and it's kind of labored, then no, the comprehension will be impacted. But I'm just saying if someone read like based on your knowledge of the student, then you would speak to them about it, you would teach to that, but if they have a solid understanding of what they've read, then that would be the level of text that would be appropriate. Some cultures may emphasize recall and memory of literal information, and so the inferential questions will be challenging. So again, if they struggle with the inference piece, that doesn't mean you have to hold them back. If they're understanding a lot of kind of the events of the story, can they identify maybe the problem and the solution of the story? Because that's just a cultural piece, and it's, how old was so and so? How many? What did they do? Versus sort of kind of digging deeper, but that will come once they're in, classroom and you're doing this with all of the students, then that will come along. So language-related approximation reading errors are attributable to readers' language and how similar or different their language is from book language. So if we get into told, so that's when you give them the word because they're unable to read it. So this would be, most often because they don't know what the word is or they're not really familiar with a sentence structure. So what is the impact on the comprehension? So how, so I guess you'd have to consider, how did the teacher respond to the need for the told? You can provide the word and allow the student to continue to read, and then you go back and explain the unfamiliar vocabulary to support comprehension once the assessment is complete. So you give the word, you keep reading, and then you go back and follow up on that word. When we look at the use of verbs and how they say them. So if we have irregular verbs, so they may often use just present tense, and this would be in the beginning. And even sometimes when they get to the intermediate level, they still may get them confused or they might not be familiar. So they might say run versus ran or come versus came, because maybe they have not learned the ED rule, or maybe they just haven't had enough time to practice it. So they might be at that stage where they're using it inconsistently. And regular verbs, they may often drop the verb endings or add it as a second syllable. So they may say asked, jumped, or they may drop it altogether. So if the student is misreading the endings, ensure that they do understand maybe who was doing the action or when this happened. And we can also go back to that piece around that oral language. So when you are speaking with them, are they using the past tense appropriately, or are they still speaking in present tense? And you would kind of apply that same to when you're assessing them. So if they're speaking that way and they read that way, then you might not count that as an error, but as, teaching instruction. But if it's, they've got it pretty well mastered for the most part in their oral language, but they're reading it wrong, then yes, that's an error. And that would be a note for instruction. And then contractions. Sometimes they don't notice them at all and they'll just continue to read them as two complete words, or they'll see the two words, but they'll insert contractions. So it may affect comprehension if they read can versus can't, but it doesn't necessarily impact it if you say I go instead of I will go. So teachers should just make note of where the students are in their learning when choosing books. So if they haven't done contractions yet and you look through a book and it's full of them, you might want to look for another book. The prepositions, they might get these mixed up just because some of them too are visually similar. So on, in, for, of, to, at. And these prepositions can be very difficult because, I mean, we can't even explain why it's on a plane and in a car. So it may not necessarily affect the comprehension. So you could just move on. And again, just reminding them to be looking all parts of the word and using that for your instruction. Again, the plurals may or may not affect comprehension. And again, you want to consider the oral language, because if they say 3 bear instead of 3 bears, it's not going to affect their understanding of what they've read. Some words that sound the same, again, can be causing some confusion for the students, especially where there's no picture to support their understanding. So you may want to, again, that's why it's important to have a device close by so that you can show them a picture if necessary. So the example I have here is hawk and hog, very different animals. So could definitely have an impact on their level of understanding. And conditional. So this is the additional examples piece. This again is very confusing in these what if scenarios, because they may take it very literal. So the example given here is, if it rains, the game will be canceled. Well, they may think the game was canceled. They didn't go to the game. So they're not really, I'll hide this, picking up on these what if situations or these comparative ones. On the other hand, so that again will could really impact their level of understanding of the text. So again, make note for instruction. You can talk about it when they finish reading. And that's it.